Today in Michigan, 3 men were convicted for their parts in a plot to kidnap Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Paul Bellard, Joe Morrison, and Mr. Morrison's father-in-law, Pete Musico, are members of the Wolverine Watchmen. That's a paramilitary group. A jury found them guilty of providing material support for terrorist acts, possessing a firearm while committing a felony, and being members of a gang. They face up to 20 years in prison. Governor Whitmer is up for re-election. Today she tweeted, quote, "These verdicts are further proof that violence and threats have no place in our politics," unquote. She shared a similar sentiment during last night's gubernatorial debate. She shared the stage with Republican candidate Tudor Dixon.
My opponent has shown tonight that she's more interested in dividing us, halting our progress, and dragging us backwards. When she's not scripted and on stage, she stokes violence, spreads conspiracy theories.
Her radical policies have crushed the state. Her choices have been destructive. But don't worry, there is another choice.
Joining us now is Professor Barbara McQuaid of the University of Michigan Law School. She is a former U.S. attorney in Michigan. Professor, welcome. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Joshua. Great to be with you.
How do today's convictions fit into the larger prosecution of this plot to kidnap the governor?
Well, this is one of 3 cases, Joshua. There was a case in federal court against 4 other men. 2 of those men ultimately were acquitted, 2 convicted of the core plot. They were sort of the ringleaders of the plot, the men who actually planned to kidnap and put on trial Governor Whitmer. This group that we saw today was a group that was convicted of providing material support for assisting in the training and providing a location where they could train in firearms. They built what they called a shoot house where they could practice extracting her from the home if she had her security detail with her. And so that crime is in the state court. There's one more trial that's pending. That trial will begin later. There's still a probable cause hearing left to go in that case. And that's for 5 men who participated in surveillance at her vacation home in northern Michigan.
Remind us exactly what the end game of this plot was. As far as I remember, it was to make a political example of her, possibly even to kill her, right?
Yes. So, in Michigan, like many states, we were hit hard and rather divided about how best to respond to the COVID pandemic. Governor Whitmer was one who had some of the most aggressive and prompt responses to the COVID pandemic with shutdown orders. And not everybody liked that. So there were protests. Some of these men participated in protests at the Capitol. But what they did went well beyond political discourse and planned a violent attack where they would kidnap her from her vacation home. They had plans to bomb the underside of a bridge so that they could slow the police pursuit, take her and put her on trial for what they said was a violation of their constitutional rights. And I think this is such an important detail, they hoped that this act would start a civil war. I've seen this allegation before, and I've seen people dismiss it as fantasy, as idle talk, as something that they knew could never happen. It is not necessary to prove that they knew they would be successful, but it is enough to show that this was part of the plan, and that there are forces in this country that want to engage in violence because they can't get their way at the ballot box. It's a very dangerous phenomenon that we're seeing, and I think it's very gratifying to see these perpetrators brought to justice, not only to hold them accountable, but to deter others who might be like-minded.
It seems like a rather extensive plot that prosecutors were able to make a case around. What was their defense? Did they even try to claim that they didn't do this or they were being misunderstood? What kind of defense did they mount?
Well, a lot of the evidence was on tape, videotape, audio tape, so it's very difficult for people to deny something when there is that kind of documentary evidence. Instead, they use what is a common tactic in cases like this, and that is to claim that they were entrapped. There were FBI agents who infiltrated the group after one man who was training with the group, who was interested in training and shooting and learning how to do those things, the camaraderie, learned about plots that involved hurting police officers. And so he reported to a friend who was a police officer what he heard going on. And so as a result of that, FBI agents served in an undercover role to infiltrate the group and to collect evidence. And so that was the defense, that this was all idle chatter. It was really just in the imagination of the FBI that this plot was occurring. And these guys really were just engaged in tough talk. But I think the evidence that they were able to put on in both the federal case and in the state case rebutted any sort of claim of entrapment when they showed that these men were actively engaging in practice, in training, in drills, in extraction from a shoot house, that they actually went to the trouble of traveling all the way to northern Michigan, to Elk Rapids, to surveil the governor's vacation home. They went twice, and they also surveilled the underside of a bridge so that they could use explosives to detonate it, damage that bridge, and slow any police chase. So it's that conduct, not just their talk, that landed them these convictions.
I imagine that'll be a big factor. Everything you just mentioned will be a big factor in the sentencing. Talk us through that. I imagine from the prosecution's point of view, they would lay out everything that you just said to the judge and make it clear that, like, this was not cosplay, right? They weren't just expressing First Amendment beliefs about how terrible the governor was. They were actually doing things that made it clear that they were not bluffing.
Yeah, so in this case, the convictions that happened today, the men face up to 20 years in prison. Now, the court will assess their culpability, will apply sentencing guidelines, and most often the sentence ends up being something less than that. I'm sure the defendants will argue that they were led astray, they were misunderstood, that this got out of hand. But the prosecution, no doubt, will point to the seriousness of their conduct. Not only that they were willing to engage in violence against another human, but they were willing to engage in violence against the governor of the state, a person who, by her position and her authority, they were seeking to undermine. They were engaging in political violence to achieve in the streets what they could not achieve in the ballot box. And that is so damaging to democracy. So I imagine that the government will be seeking a very strong sentence to deter other people who might be inclined to engage in similar activity in the future.
Before I have to let you go, I think it's easy for people to look at cases like this and say that things are getting worse, right? That they're worse than they've ever been, that political violence and all this rhetoric has made things crazy. I kind of always wonder whether this is something different or this is just something that we're noticing more because of the political times that we're in. And if you talk to a prosecutor or an investigator, they'd be like, I could tell you stories from 20 years ago that would stand your teeth on edge. Is this getting worse, or are we just noticing it more?
I think it's getting worse. I think part of it is that social media allows like-minded people to find each other. It allows them to normalize their behavior. And so what used to be a disgruntled guy in his basement is now somebody who can connect with others. They hear from leaders of political movements that someone has stolen the election and that if we don't fight like hell, we're not going to have a country anymore. Those kinds of statements land with certain people in a way that sparks action. And so I do think that the threat is greater than ever before. But the silver lining here, I think, is that law enforcement was able to respond to this plot and jurors were able to see this case for what it was and return guilty verdicts.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.